Alright, hey everybody, and welcome to, this is going to be the final video, for chapter 10. So we're talking about language comprehension. We're going to be talking about the different stages of comprehension now. This is going to be a long video, and in a lot of ways it's not going to be as fun as the other videos too. So please help yourself to a cup of coffee. You know I got mine, and let's tackle this together. So we're almost there at the end of the longest chapter of the book. Let's do this. So when we start talking about how language is formed, you may remember that you heard me talk about, semantics, phonology, and syntax. And those are ideas that we're coming back to here. So here what you're looking at is a diagram of the way that sentences are parsed out. There's a lot of things going on in sentences. We've just been using sentences so much in our always in our daily communication that we don't even really think about how complex it is. But if we have this very simple sentence, the umpires talk to the players, we'll see that there are different phrases inside that sentence. There's the phrase the umpires, and then there is the phrase talk to the players. So we have the subject phrase, and then we have the action phrase, right? From there, we have these phrases are made up of words. So we have these words, right? So we have these individual words. These individual words are made up out of morphemes. Morphemes are units of meaning. So, for example, the is its own meaning, right? So the is its own meaning. But we also see that umpires has two morphemes. It has the meaning of umpire, and it also has the S, the plural, that lets you know that this is actually more than one. And if we look at talked, we see that talked has two morphemes as well. It has talk, and it also has ed, which lets us know the meaning of ed is that this is something that happened in the past. And if we look at players, this one word has three different meanings embedded in it. It has the word play, has er, which lets you know that it's somebody who has done the playing, and then there's an S letting you know there are multiple people who have been assigned this role as player. So that's a lot of stuff going on. We don't think about any of that stuff whenever we hear this stuff, right? We just think about what the meaning is almost immediately. And then you can take down the morpheme and you can break that out into what sounds are made here. And so ultimately what we're looking at here is at the sentence level, we're kind of looking at the semantics. We're looking at what does this mean? But we're also looking at the syntax of it. So we're looking at what things are in order. So for example, you could switch this up. So you could say the players talk to the umpires. That means something totally different, right? Changes the order, changes the action. And if we look down here, even at a smaller level, we have phonology represented in these phonemes, but we also have semanticity and semantics represented again in the morphemes. So let's talk a little bit about this. There are three different stages of language comprehension. We've already talked a lot about the first stage, which is the perceptual stage. So things like learning speech and acquiring speech and hearing the boundaries of words. That is all the first stage. So we're not going to revisit that. We've already done it. What we're going to be talking about in this video are stages 2 and 3. Stages 2, which is the longest of them, is going to be the parsing stage, and stage 3 is the utilization stage, which is where we come to start thinking about how that language is represented in the mind. All right. So let's talk about parsing. When we start talking about parsing, what we're going to start doing is start breaking out a sentence into its individual phrases. Those individual phrases are sometimes called constituents. And constituents are I always think of them as like the building blocks of language, because you can't have a sentence without phrases. And ultimately, what these constituents do is basically they help us provide more information, they help us provide more context, they help us identify what it is that we are talking about. So when we are breaking down a sentence, it's very important for us to identify what the constituents are. And after we after we have a constituent, you're going to see that there is going to be a small break, a small pause that allow people to process what is being said. And after each of these phrases, you don't have to reiterate and re-talk about these things again. We assume in the sentence that that's already there. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. That whenever we are comprehending things, that we're going to be taking the meaning of things one phrase at a time. And then after that sentence, it's almost as if we kind of reset things. Here is an example. Sorry, my nose is itchy. Here's an example of what we're talking about. So you're looking on the x-axis is essentially kind of the words as they go on through the sentence, and on the y-axis you're going to have how long it takes people to really say and process what they are thinking about. So here we go. Because of its lasting construction as well as its motor's power, the boat was of high quality. So in this case, you see there were a couple of pauses, right? So we have because of its lasting construction, pause, as well as its motor's power, cause, the boat the boat was of high quality. In this case, you see there are pausing after each of these phrases. And because essentially what we're doing is we're pausing so that we can very quickly reflect on what we've just said or what we've just read. So because of its lasting construction, so we're thinking about its construction, as well as its motor's power, we're thinking about its power, and then we get on to the end of it. Now, once we get to say that phrase, once it has been said, ultimately those words are kind of locked in, and we don't have to rethink about them. We don't have to revisit what that is. We can keep moving on. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. Sometimes we're going to see that leads us into the wrong direction, which is kind of fun, which is kind of interesting. So whenever we are reading a sentence, we're going to take the meaning of each word and then basically kind of use the end of that sentence to wrap up our thoughts. Or excuse me, the end of that phrase to wrap up our thoughts. So you can kind of think about it as like we end a phrase and that pause is us reflecting on what each of those words mean. And then we move on. So when we start to interpret a sentence, that actually happens before we encounter the main verb. As you saw when we were talking about the umpires, right? The umpires, we haven't even got to the verb yet, and we're already thinking about what the sentence means. So we're starting to interpret what this sentence is before we encounter the verb, and sometimes that leads us astray, where we have an idea about what it is that we're reading, and then we get to the verb or another noun, and we realize we were thinking about it incorrectly, which is a type of ambiguity we're going to talk about in this video. So when we talk about semantics and syntax, we talk about whether those two things are totally independent from one another or whether or not they rely on one another. And I think that really is kind of the same kind of connection that we have between thoughts and language. That, yeah, it seems like they inform one another. They influence one another. We find that syntax can help the way that we comprehend sentences. We can also see how syntax can disrupt our ability to comprehend sentences. That orderly syntax is going to help us understand things. Disorderly syntax is going to hurt our ability to understand things. And sometimes that is just in the way that words are ordered. In other ways, it is how that stuff is inflected. That is something called prosody. Prosody is basically the way that we speak. Has different kinds of inflections that are going to help us emphasize and de-emphasize or highlight certain specific things. So if I said, if you give me another wrong answer, if you give me a wrong answer again, you're going to be in trouble. Then you know that the key thing that I'm upset there is the word again, which means that you've probably done this several times, right? Because I'm focusing on again, and that helps contribute to your understanding of what I'm trying to say. If I said, if you get that wrong again, you're going to be in trouble. That, again, the syntax is all the same, essentially. The word order is all the same. The inflection point then is on the word wrong. So that I'm letting you know that the key point here is that if you get it wrong, And we could even change it up again, so that if I were to say, if you get that wrong again, you're going to be in trouble. So that then I'm pointing you out specifically, that this is you, that you get the idea. That basically all these things are going to have slightly different meanings based on our prosody and based on how we are inflecting and emphasizing those words. Here's an example. So the boy, the girl I liked was sick. Or sorry, I can't even read. The boy the girl liked was sick, versus the girl liked the boy that was sick. Both of these things essentially, they mean different things, but you can see how one of them is a little bit easier to read. The first one, the boy the girl liked was sick, is a little bit harder than the girl liked the boy that was sick. So this first one, for example, you have this phrase, and you have this phrase, and you have this phrase, that basically you're talking about the boy who liked somebody, and the sick person is over here, so it's all kind of tangled up, right? And so that can contribute to us misunderstanding what's being said here and having to go back and reread things. We find that whenever things are easy to understand, that they don't require a lot of Broca's area activation. Whenever something is hard to understand, it requires a lot of Broca's area activation, which you can think about in terms of, remember Broca's area? We talked about at the very beginning of this chapter. It's used a lot in how we perceive, in how we generate language. And so just because you generate language verbally doesn't mean that you don't generate it subverbally, right? So just even thinking about these things, if it's a complicated sentence, you're going to have more activation for Broca's area. Other things that we're going to talk about for parsing here and the relationship between syntax and semantics is that there are often times in which we have to rely on other things outside of the sentence to interpret what we mean. So we don't always take words literally. Sometimes we can take the context in which they appear to provide interpretation there. And when we are encountering an ambiguous sentence, we're going to rely a lot on the syntax. That's different than other cultures. I think that it's Italian, for example, that doesn't always rely on the syntax and sometimes relies more on the semantics. But whenever you have an ambiguous sentence. But for American speakers, we rely a lot on the syntax to help us pull through that. All right, so neuroimaging evidence suggests that essentially that if you have problems with semantic errors, or if you have difficulties with syntax errors, that those are going to elicit different responses in the brain, which suggests to us that there's probably different regions of the brain that are equipped to handle and to coordinate our understanding of what is being said. So I've hinted that we're talking about ambiguity. Let's talk about ambiguity. So there are a couple of different kinds of ambiguity that we're going to focus on. The first here is going to be transient ambiguity. The textbook talks about garden path sentences. Garden path sentences are any kind of sentence where you have something that is ambiguous, but it's cleared up by the time that sentence is over. So a garden path sentence is one in which you have that ambiguity, and you might make a wrong interpretation of what that word means first, and so you have to go back and correct yourself. So transient ambiguity is when it is solved by the end of the sentence, which can sometimes be frustrating, and because of that, it leads us to what's called the principle of minimal attachment. Essentially, the principle of minimal attachment is, as we were talking about when we were talking about parsing in constituents, is that we will interpret something until we have reason to interpret it a different way. So we're kind of like locked in with the words that we choose to interpret. And so if we understood the wrong thing, that it takes until later for us to go back and reverse that, and generally we have to go back and reread it. So we try to interpret things in a way that is going to cause minimal effort until that phrase is totally over. And then by the end of that sentence, that's when we lock it in. That's whenever we say, like, okay, this is what that sentence means. So here is some kind of like neuroimaging results of transient ambiguity processing for these individuals. This is used with fMRI. And so what you're looking at right here on the x-axis as time goes by, and on the y-axis you're looking at the percent signal change from fixation. So when they're fixating on something that is the fixation cue versus, in this case, an unambiguous word and two different kinds of ambiguous words. So how do we interpret what it is that we're looking at here? Let's look at the unambiguous words first. So this first one we're looking at here, activation in Broca's area goes up a little bit, but the least of the three different conditions. If we were to look at, let's say that you interpret a word, but it was the wrong interpretation and you find that out later, you're going to see the highest activation in Broca's area compared to all the others. So you have the highest activation whenever you misinterpret a word and then you realize that that was a misinterpretation. If you have an ambiguous word and you are right about that interpretation from the beginning, then you're going to be okay. Then you're going to not have to go back and revise what you thought, but you also see that that is kind of right in the middle between these two. That there's a little bit more activation than if it's an unambiguous word, but less activation than if it is an ambiguous word that you got wrong. The other kind of ambiguity is lexical ambiguity. And lexical ambiguity is whenever you come across a word that by its nature has an ambiguous meaning, we're going to select kind of what it means within the first 700 milliseconds. So an example of this would be if I told you the bank collapsed. The bank collapsed could mean a couple of different things. It could be a financial institution, which is a bank, or it could be the side of a ravine or side of a river, right? That's also a bank. So the way that we would clear that up is just by simply reading on, right? We would need more context in order to be able to read that, in order to make sense of it. So how is it that we are able to clear up this ambiguity? We've already talked about this a little bit. Part of it is going to be the syntax that we use, and part of it is going to be looking for context clues that help us understand what it is that we are reading. But in order to clear that up, we need to move forward a little bit to the third stage, the final stage of language comprehension, which is utilization. And in utilization, in order to clear up ambiguity, we're going to have inferences. These inferences can be forward and they can be backwards. So a backwards inference is often sometimes called bridging, and ultimately what this is whenever you are thinking back to what you just read. So you are understanding the next sentence by reflecting on what you just read and integrating it into what you just read. And you absolutely need this in order to understand a paragraph or to understand sentences and as they relate to one another. So when we are clearing up ambiguity, a lot of what we're doing is going to be backwards inferences. We're going to be looking back to see what kind of bank were they talking about in that particular sentence. Another example here is going to be forward inferences, and this is sometimes called elaboration or elaborative inferences. In this case, you're going to be anticipating the meanings of things, and this can make comprehension easier, but it's not exactly necessary. So if you're reading something and you assume you know where this paragraph is going, knowing that and anticipating that can help you understand that information better. And if you make a prediction about where this paragraph is going to end and you were wrong about it, you'll still remember it well because you will remember that it went against your expectations. So we have these two different inferences moving back and forward, where backward inferences are required to think about how new information is relevant to what we just learned, and forward inferences is taking what we've just learned and thinking about, speculating about how it might fit into what we're about to read and about to hear. So backwards inference, as I mentioned, is often called a bridge, and this is whenever we are looking at essentially using syntax cues and semantic cues to understand what it is that we are reading. So an example here is the word the. The word the is something that is going to help us make a reference. It is a very simple, where's my cue? Here we go. It is a very simple reference, but what we're saying is that this word the is referring to the existence of another noun that you should be thinking about. So, for example, if we were to say Jeremy adopted a cat, the cat was only 4 weeks old. The word the, in this case, is letting you know, you're bridging, you're thinking back to, oh, this is not just a cat, not just any cat, this is the cat, this is Jeremy's cat. So the is referencing back to information you had already learned about. For example, if you just got this phrase, the cat was 4 weeks old, that's fine. You don't know what cat it's talking about though, right? And then let's say that you just swap these sentences around. So that you said, the cat was only 4 weeks old, Jeremy adopted a cat. There'd be a little bit of confusion there, right? Because you would be wondering, well, he adopted a cat. Is it the cat that's 4 weeks old? And if it's not, then why'd you tell me about this cat that's 4 weeks old, right? I want to know more about Jeremy, this cute cat that he's got, right? So, in this case, this is a bridging inference. What you're doing is you are looking back and you're making connections with this prior material. You're going to see this a lot with pronouns. Anytime you have a pronoun, so you're using the word. So if we're talking about Jeremy, and if he goes by he, him pronouns, we're going to say like, Jeremy adopted a cat, his cat was 4 years old. We know exactly whose cat that was. We don't have to also say Jeremy's cat was 4 years old or 4 weeks old. We got that. We know that his, the pronoun, is referring back to that. And we do that through this bridging inference. That's going to help clear up ambiguity, but it's also going to help us connect these sentences to one another so that we can better understand the gist of this paragraph and the importance of this paragraph and why this paragraph is important. All right, so I hope that answered some of your questions about how we comprehend languages, but if we don't, usually people have a lot of questions about this stuff. Feel free to let me know if you have any of those other questions. I did prepare a couple of slides in case you had any kinds of questions about some commonly asked questions, and you'll also find lots of very cool trailers, very cool scenes and clips of other things, including Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, as long as people who are polyglots, so in other words they speak lots of different languages, as well as looking at different examples of non-human language. So there's lots of cool stuff here. Definitely check it out if you get a couple of minutes spare. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video, which is going to be about our friend decision making, but also we're going to be talking about prospect theory and how our decision making styles are not always as rational as we might want them to be. All right, I'll see you there.